The courtroom falls silent. Elena stands trembling as lawyers brandish falsified documents designed to destroy her. Years of custody battles, destroyed careers, buried accusations surface in devastating detail. But then, David's voice cuts through the chaos. He speaks words that will change everything. How did a billionaire's vegetative son become the key witness in his own mother's exoneration? Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Marcus Wellington had everything a man could want. A self-made billionaire at 42, he controlled one of the largest pharmaceutical empires in North America. His office on the 94th floor had views of the entire city. His signature was worth millions. His word moved markets. But none of it meant anything when he looked at his son. The doctors had given him the diagnosis when his wife was still pregnant. Severe hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy, brain damage from lack of oxygen during labor. The specialists used phrases like irreversible damage, minimal awareness, and vegetative state. His wife had cried in the hospital. Marcus had stood by the window staring at the city below, feeling nothing. When little David was finally born, he looked normal. Small fingers, tiny toes, a full head of dark hair. But inside, the doctor said, there was almost nothing. No neural activity in key regions. No response to stimuli. The machinery around his crib beeped constantly. Tubes ran in and out of his small body like he was part of the hospital itself, rather than a person who belonged in it. The neonatal ICU became their second home for weeks. Specialists came and went, speaking in low voices about prognosis and outcomes. Marcus listened to every word, searching for hope where there was none. His wife, Sarah, held David's hand for hours, whispering prayers and promises. But deep down, Marcus knew what they all knew. His son was gone. Not dead, but not alive either. Something in between. Sarah had refused to believe it at first. She demanded second opinions, then third opinions. Neurologists from around the country came to examine David. Some were kinder than others, but they all said essentially the same thing. The damage was too severe. The probability of any meaningful recovery was less than 5%. By the time David was 6 months old, Sarah had stopped asking for new opinions. She had stopped whispering promises, too. Instead, she sat beside his crib with a blank expression, sometimes for hours without moving. When David was finally discharged from the hospital, they brought him home to an enormous house that suddenly felt suffocating. Nurses were hired. Equipment was installed. The spare bedroom on the second floor became a medical suite. Monitors, feeding tubes, machines that helped him breathe, machines that measured everything. Marcus had the best care money could buy for a son who couldn't know he was alive. The first year at home was the hardest. Sarah tried everything at first. Music therapy, gentle touch, exercises the neurologist suggested. Nothing worked. David never opened his eyes, never moved on his own, never made a sound. By David's first birthday, the house had fallen into a careful routine of silence. Nurses changed shifts, feeding tubes were cleaned, machines hummed their mechanical songs. Sarah had started spending more time away from the house, first for a few hours, then whole days. She took a job at a nonprofit that helped families dealing with pediatric trauma. Marcus realized she was running away. He couldn't blame her. Being in that house, walking past David's room, seeing the life they had planned evaporate, it was too much. 6 months after that first birthday, Sarah announced she was leaving. Not permanently at first. A trial separation. She needed time to think, space to breathe. She kept saying she loved Marcus, but she couldn't stay. The house became quieter after she left. Just Marcus and the nurses, and the sound of machines keeping a ghost of a child alive. Marcus threw himself into work, spending 12-hour days at the office, signing deals, attending meetings, anything to avoid coming home. But eventually, he always had to return. He would walk past David's room, sometimes stopping in the doorway. His son lay on a special medical bed, eyes closed, body small and still. Marcus never knew what to feel. Love mixed with grief mixed with something darker. Resentment, maybe. Or guilt. Or the crushing weight of knowing he had created this situation through the simple act of existing, of meeting Sarah, of wanting a child. The years passed, David turned 3, then 5. He had grown physically, but nothing else had changed. He was still locked inside a broken body and a shattered mind. Doctors said it was a miracle he had survived this long. They seemed almost confused by his persistence. Marcus hired the best neurologists, paid for experimental treatments, investigated every new therapy. Nothing changed. David remained what he had always been. Impossible. When Elena Davis walked through the front door of the Wellington estate on a gray Tuesday morning, she had no idea what she was walking into. All she knew was that she needed work. She had moved to the city 6 months ago from a small town in Georgia where memories clung to every street corner. Memories of a daughter who didn't want to remember her. Memories of mistakes that couldn't be undone. She had arrived in the city with one suitcase and a determination to disappear into a new life. The housekeeping job had seemed perfect. Large estate, good pay, flexible hours, minimal interaction. The ad had specifically requested someone comfortable working with special needs situations, but didn't require formal medical training. Elena had been working as a home health aide before everything fell apart. That life was gone now, along with everything else. But the skills remained. She could handle medical equipment. She could manage routine. She could do this job well and ask no questions. Marcus Wellington had conducted the interview via video call. He was a striking man with sharp features and sharper eyes. During the conversation, he had mentioned his son only briefly. Severe neurological condition, he said, moving past it quickly. He didn't ask about her past. He didn't ask about her family, or her reasons for moving, or why she was willing to take a job that seemed designed to be isolating. He just offered her a salary that made her eyes widen and told her to start the following Tuesday. Now, standing in the marble foyer of the Wellington mansion, Elena felt the weight of the place. High ceilings, expensive art, everything immaculate and cold. A housekeeper named Mrs. Chen showed her around, gesturing quickly through the main rooms. The kitchen was larger than Elena's entire apartment. The library had more books than the local library back home. The living room was decorated in grays and whites like a hotel lobby. Then Mrs. Chen led her upstairs to the second floor. She stopped in front of a closed wooden door and lowered her voice slightly. "David's room," she said. "Mr. Wellington prefers we don't disturb him too much. Just cleaning, checking equipment, bringing meals. The nursing staff handles his medical care." Elena nodded. She had expected this. Most wealthy families with severely disabled children preferred the situation to remain invisible. They didn't want to see it. They didn't want to be reminded of it. Mrs. Chen opened the door slightly, just enough for Elena to peer inside. The room was set up like a medical facility, masquerading as a bedroom. Machines lined the walls. A hospital bed dominated the center. Elena could see a small figure on the bed, a child with his eyes closed and his hands resting at his sides. For a moment, Elena couldn't move. There was something about seeing him that struck her differently than she had expected. He looked peaceful, almost like he was simply sleeping. A child untouched by the cruelty of the world. Mrs. Chen closed the door. "That's David," she said, then continued down the hallway. Elena was given a small room on the 3rd floor. It was neat and clean with a window that overlooked the gardens. For the first few days, Elena kept to herself. She cleaned the common areas, helped in the kitchen, organized supply closets. The routine was simple and required no emotional investment. On her 4th day, she was cleaning the hallway near David's room when she heard a sound. Not a loud sound, but distinct. A kind of soft noise, almost like a whisper. Elena paused her work and listened. The sound didn't repeat. She continued cleaning, but something had shifted. She had heard something, even if no one else seemed to notice. 2 weeks into the job, Elena began to wonder about the people who came to care for David. There were 3 nurses who rotated shifts. They seemed competent, but distant. They came in, performed their duties efficiently, and left. None of them seemed to actually engage with David. They didn't speak to him. They didn't play music or read to him. They simply maintained him like he was a piece of equipment that needed servicing. Elena found this strange. Her training, what little she had received, had emphasized that even unconscious patients could benefit from human connection. But she kept her observations to herself. She was the housekeeper. Her job was not to question the medical staff. One afternoon, while doing laundry on the second floor, Elena found herself alone in the hallway. She paused near David's door, listening. Nothing. She turned to leave, and then something made her stop. She knocked softly. Not a loud knock, just a quiet one. She waited a few seconds and then opened the door a crack. David was on his bed, in the same position he was always in. Eyes closed. Still. But Elena noticed something she hadn't seen before. His eyelids had twitched slightly. Just a small movement, barely perceptible. Elena closed the door quietly and walked away. She told no one. But she had seen it. The soft knock on his door never came again. But Elena had been changed by that moment. She started paying closer attention. She would clean near David's room and listen. She noticed patterns in the sounds he made. A particular time of day when he seemed to make more noise. A way his breathing changed when certain staff members entered the room versus others. She wasn't a doctor or a neurologist, but she had eyes and ears, and an instinct that had served her well in her previous work. 2 weeks later, Elena made a decision that she knew might be foolish. She was alone in the house. The nurses had all gone. Marcus was at his office downtown. Elena went into David's room and closed the door quietly behind her. The boy lay motionless on his medical bed. Elena approached slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. She had learned long ago that people responded better to calm, predictable presence. She sat in a chair near the bed and simply sat, not speaking, not trying anything, just being present. After 5 minutes, she opened her mouth and began to hum. It was a melody her grandmother had taught her when she was a child, a lullaby in minor key that somehow contained both sadness and comfort. Elena hummed quietly, eyes closed, letting the melody fill the room. The machines beeped their steady rhythm. The afternoon light filtered through the blinds, and Elena hummed. When she opened her eyes 10 minutes later, something had changed. David's chest was rising and falling more deeply than before, as if he had released tension he hadn't known he was holding. Elena stopped humming and waited. Nothing else happened. But she knew. Something had shifted. The next day, Elena returned. She sat in the same chair and hummed the same melody. This time she thought she saw it again. A tiny movement in his eyelids, just the slightest flutter, like the faintest dream. This time she didn't tell herself she was imagining things. She knew what she had seen. That night, Elena sat in her room and did something she hadn't done in months. She cried. Not tears of sadness exactly, though there was that too. Tears of something deeper. Recognition, maybe. Or hope. Or the strange sensation of being called to do something important by someone who couldn't call at all. For weeks, Elena maintained the careful balance. She did her job as a housekeeper. She cleaned and organized and stayed quiet. But whenever she had a moment alone, she would slip into David's room. Sometimes she would sit quietly. Sometimes she would hum the lullaby. Sometimes she would simply stand near his bed, her hand hovering near his without quite touching. She was afraid of disturbing him, or worse, of being caught. The consequences of crossing professional boundaries in a house like this would be severe, but she couldn't stop. Something about David had become essential to her. Like tending to him was the only real work she was meant to do. Then one afternoon, while Elena was changing the sheets on David's bed, she accidentally bumped his arm. She froze, expecting him to cry out or show distress. Instead, something remarkable happened. His fingers curled slightly. Not a reflex, not an involuntary response, a choice. Elena stared at his hand for nearly a minute, afraid to move, afraid the moment would break. His small fingers uncurled slowly and went still again. But Elena had felt it, the distinct sensation of intention. She slowly moved her hand closer to his. She waited. Then she gently pressed her fingers against his palm. For a moment, nothing happened, and then his fingers moved again, curling around her hand, holding on. Elena closed her eyes and breathed. Years of training had not prepared her for this moment. No textbook, no certification, No lecture had explained what it felt like when a child who was supposed to be gone made an actual choice to connect with you. The sensation was overwhelming. When Marcus came home that evening, he found Elena in the kitchen preparing dinner. She was acting normally, speaking politely about grocery deliveries and repair schedules. But inside, she was vibrating with knowledge that she didn't know how to hold. That evening, she sat in her room and pulled out her phone. She searched for information about children in vegetative states, about locked-in syndrome, about the possibility of consciousness existing beneath the surface of apparent unconsciousness. What she found was conflicting. Some research suggested that patients thought to be unaware sometimes showed measurable responses to stimuli. Some studies documented unlikely awakenings years after initial diagnosis, but most of the medical consensus remained clear. Severe hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy at birth typically resulted in profound, permanent disability. There was no coming back from that level of damage. And yet, Elena had felt David's fingers hold hers. She was certain of it. The next morning, Elena made a choice that could cost her the job. She requested a meeting with Marcus Wellington. She waited until he was about to leave for work. She approached him in the foyer with her hands folded and her voice steady. "I need to speak with you about David," she said. Marcus turned to her with an expression of mild annoyance. "Is he in pain? Are the machines failing?" Elena shook her head. "He's responding," she said carefully, "to stimuli, to presence. I've observed it multiple times." Marcus stared at her like she had suggested something impossible. "The doctors have all confirmed that David is in a persistent vegetative state," he said, his tone making clear that this conversation was approaching its end. "That's not possible." Elena took a breath. "With respect, Mr. Wellington, I've worked with patients before. I've seen responsive behaviors that others missed. David's pupils dilate. His breathing changes. His fingers moved and held my hand intentionally this morning." Marcus's expression hardened. "That's enough," he said quietly. "You were hired to clean this house, not to offer medical speculation." Elena felt the dismissal, but she pushed forward anyway. "I'm asking you to consider it. To observe him yourself. Maybe bring in someone to do a proper evaluation." Marcus turned away from her. His voice was final. "If you want to keep this job, I suggest you remember what your job is." Elena walked away, her heart pounding. She had crossed a line. She knew she probably would be fired by the end of the day. But she also knew something that Marcus Wellington wasn't ready to accept. His son was in there. Somewhere beneath the broken neural pathways, David was present, and that changed everything. That night, Elena prepared her room to be vacated. She packed her suitcase and placed it by the door. She had learned long ago that sometimes standing up for what you believe means losing everything. But she couldn't regret it. As she lay in bed, she thought about David. She hoped that even if she was gone tomorrow, someone would listen. Someone would actually look at him. Someone would see what was waiting to be discovered. She fell asleep with tears on her pillow and the melody of the lullaby in her head. But Elena did not get fired. The next morning she arrived at the kitchen to find Marcus already seated at the table with a cup of coffee. His face was unreadable. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then he said 4 words. "Tell me everything you've observed." For the next 2 hours, Elena sat across from Marcus and described every tiny thing she had noticed. The sounds David made at particular times, the way his breathing shifted when people entered the room, the flutter of his eyelids, the movement of his fingers. She told him about the moment she hummed and felt his chest relax. She told him about his fingers holding hers. Marcus listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. Within an hour, a neurologist had arrived at the house. Her name was Dr. Patricia Santos, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen many impossible things. She examined David thoroughly, checking his responses to light, sound, and touch. She ran tests with specialized equipment. She spent an hour simply observing him. When she finished, she had something to say that Marcus Wellington had not heard in 5 years. "We need to do more extensive testing," Dr. Santos said. "And I need to be honest with you. The original diagnosis may have been premature. There appears to be measurable neurological activity that contradicts a vegetative state. Marcus felt something in his chest shift, a crack in the wall he had built around his hope. David might be conscious, she continued carefully, or at least semi-conscious. He may be trapped in a state similar to locked-in syndrome. Aware, but unable to communicate through traditional means. The damage is severe, but consciousness doesn't always leave the way we expect it to. Elena stood quietly in the corner of the room, letting this moment belong to Marcus. He was staring at David with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It looked like hope, and fear, and the terrible ache of realizing what he might have lost in his willingness to believe the worst. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. Dr. Santos arranged for advanced neuroimaging. Specialists came to the house for consultations. A speech pathologist and an occupational therapist were brought in to begin working on communication strategies. The nurses' attitudes shifted once Marcus insisted on more interactive engagement with David. Someone even played music in his room now. And Marcus found himself spending time with his son in a way he never had before. He would sit by the bed and talk, not to a vegetative state, but to the person trapped inside it. He talked about his day. He talked about memories of Sarah. He talked about his failures as a father, his guilt, his desperate hope that it wasn't too late. Elena watched this transformation from her position as a member of the household staff. She had not returned to being invisible. Marcus had quietly told her that her job security was absolute. She would be part of David's recovery team, but more than that, something had shifted in how he looked at her. She was no longer simply an employee who had overstepped. She was someone who had seen his son when he himself had refused to see. And for a man like Marcus Wellington, that kind of debt ran very deep. 3 months into the intensive evaluation and stimulation protocols, something remarkable happened. Elena was in David's room on a Thursday morning, playing soft music and reading to him from a children's book. She was describing a picture of a bird when she noticed his head had turned slightly toward the sound of her voice. Not an involuntary reflex, a deliberate turn. His eyes were still closed, but his head was oriented toward her. Elena went very still. She continued reading, keeping her voice steady and calm. When she finished the page, she paused. Then she heard it. A sound from David, not the meaningless vocalization of a vegetative patient. A sound with intention, a sound that almost resembled a word. Elena put the book down and waited, hardly breathing. The sound didn't repeat, but she knew. She had heard it. She ran downstairs and found Marcus in his study. He took one look at her face and stood immediately. "What is it? What happened?" Elena told him. They raced upstairs to David's room. Elena explained what she had heard, describing it in as much detail as she could remember. Then they did something they had never done before. They waited together. They sat by David's bed in silence, giving him space to make choices. 10 minutes passed. 20, 30, and then it came again. That same sound, that almost word. Marcus leaned forward, his hand reaching toward David's but not quite touching. He spoke softly. "David, can you hear me?" The sound came again, louder this time. Almost a yes. Marcus turned to Elena with tears in his eyes. "He's in there," he whispered. "My boy is in there." Elena nodded, not trusting her voice. They both understood that they were standing at the threshold of something that was about to change everything. Dr. Santos was called back to the house immediately. When she arrived and heard the sounds David had been making, her expression shifted from professional neutrality to genuine interest. "This is significant," she said, setting up portable monitoring equipment. "We need to establish baseline responses and track progression." She spent the afternoon with David, documenting his vocalizations, testing his responses to different stimuli, creating a detailed record of what she was observing. By evening, Dr. Santos had confirmed what Elena had already known. David was definitely responding to external input. His brain was working. His consciousness was present. The question now was not whether he was aware, but how aware he was, and what could be done to help him communicate. Marcus sat in the hallway outside David's room that night, unable to sleep. He thought about all the years he had spent avoiding his son, All the days he had let the medical consensus dictate his behavior. All the time he had lost because he had been too afraid to believe in something that contradicted the narrative he had accepted. Elena found him there around midnight. She brought 2 cups of tea and sat beside him without speaking. For a long time, they just sat in silence. Then Marcus spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I almost gave up on him. I almost let my son die inside his own mind because I didn't have the courage to question the experts." Elena didn't offer platitudes. She simply said, "He didn't give up on himself." And that was enough. The next morning, Marcus made calls. He canceled meetings, delegated responsibilities, and cleared his calendar. He announced to his staff that he would be taking an extended leave from the office to focus on his son's care and recovery. No one questioned him. The Wellington name carried enough weight that such decisions were simply accepted. By afternoon, he had assembled a team. Dr. Santos would oversee all neurological management. A speech pathologist would work on developing alternative communication methods. A physical therapist would begin mobility exercises. A special educator would work on cognitive stimulation. And Elena, whose official job remained housekeeping, would be part of the daily care team. Her instinct for what David needed had proven more valuable than any degree. For the first time in 5 years, the Wellington house felt like something other than a tomb. There was activity, purpose, and most importantly, there was hope. Marcus spent hours each day with David now. He talked to him. He read to him. He played music and described the world outside his window. He shared his regrets and his newfound belief that his son could still become part of his life. Elena watched these interactions with a complicated mix of emotions. She was genuinely happy for the transformation she was witnessing. But she also felt something else. A awareness that she had become deeply invested in David's recovery. Too invested, perhaps. In a way that went beyond professional care. This realization frightened her, because she knew better than anyone how dangerous it was to love a situation you couldn't control. She had learned that lesson with her own daughter, but she pushed the fear aside. David needed her. Marcus needed her. And for now, that was enough justification for the risk she was taking. 1 week after Dr. Santos's initial visit, something extraordinary happened. Elena was working with David on a new communication system that had been designed specifically for him. It involved a series of sounds and slight head movements that could be interpreted as yes and no. They had been practicing the sounds together, Elena making them first, then waiting for David to mimic. They had been at it for over an hour when David made a sound that was distinctly different from anything he had produced before. It was shaped like a word. A real word. Elena froze. "David," she whispered, "did you just try to say something?" The sound came again, more clearly this time. It almost sounded like my. Elena's hands started shaking. She ran to get Marcus. They raced back to David's room together. Elena explained what she had heard. Marcus sat down beside his son and took his hand. "David, I'm here. Can you try again?" David's face seemed to concentrate. The sound came. My, and then another sound. Da. My dad. Elena and Marcus both went completely still. David had just attempted to say, "My dad." It wasn't clear. Wasn't perfect. But it was unmistakably an attempt at real language. Marcus bent his head and wept. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming emotion of his son. Finally reaching out to acknowledge him. David was in there. His son had always been in there. And now, after all these years, David was fighting his way back. That moment marked a turning point that no specialist had predicted. Once David had produced his first real words, he continued trying. Some attempts were clear, others were barely recognizable, but the effort was consistent and increasing. Within 2 weeks, he could produce simple words with reasonable clarity. Mama. Number. Yes. Please. Water. Pain. Doctor. Each word was a miracle. Each word represented David clawing his way back from the prison of his own broken body. Marcus documented everything. He hired a specialized speech therapist who worked with locked-in patients. He brought in additional neurologists for consultations. He reached out to medical researchers who were studying consciousness and communication in severely brain-injured patients. The Wellington estate became an informal research facility, with David at its center. The boy who had been written off, dismissed as a vegetative state, was now being studied as a potential breakthrough case. But through it all, it was Elena who remained closest to David. She was the one who spent the most time with him, who understood his needs without him having to articulate them, who hummed the lullaby that seemed to calm him when nothing else worked. And David responded to her in ways he didn't quite respond to others. His vocalizations were clearer when she was present. His willingness to try new communication methods seemed stronger. There was something between them that transcended the professional boundaries of caregiver and patient. It was something deeper, something that Marcus began to notice, and slowly to understand. One afternoon, Marcus found Elena sitting alone in David's room. David was sleeping, and Elena was simply watching him, her expression tender and protective. Marcus realized in that moment what he had been avoiding acknowledging. Elena loved his son, not as an employee performing duties, but as someone who had genuine love for the boy. And watching David begin to live again, Marcus understood that Elena's love had made all the difference. The boy was responding to her because she saw him not as a tragedy, not as a medical curiosity, but as a person worthy of fighting for. It was a lesson Marcus wished he had learned years ago, but perhaps it wasn't too late. Perhaps the fact that he was learning it now meant that David still had time. They all did. The realization hit Marcus like a wave. Elena loved David. Not as an employee, not professionally, but with the deep, protective love of a parent. And in that love, she had accomplished what millions of dollars and the best experts in the world could not. She had reached his son. She had brought him back. Marcus stood there in the doorway of David's room, watching Elena sleep in the chair beside David's bed, and he felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't just gratitude, though there was that. It was recognition. Recognition that this woman, this remarkable woman who had walked into their lives as a simple housekeeper, was the reason David was still fighting, the reason David was coming back. Marcus quietly closed the door and walked downstairs to his study. He poured himself a drink he didn't want and sat in the darkness, thinking. He thought about his marriage to Sarah, how it had crumbled under the weight of their shared grief. He thought about the years he had spent running from David, from the pain of watching his son exist, but not live. He thought about all the professional care, all the equipment, all the money that had changed nothing. And then Elena had arrived, and everything had changed. She had arrived carrying her own burden of loss, her own hidden pain. He had looked up her background after she pushed him about David. He had read about her custody case, about the accusations against her, about the daughter she had lost. He knew she was broken, and yet, somehow, she had seen the spark of life in his son when everyone else, including Marcus himself, had given up. That took a kind of courage he had never possessed. The next morning, Marcus made a decision. When Elena came down for breakfast, he asked her to sit with him. His tone was serious enough that she looked worried, perhaps thinking he was about to let her go. Instead, he said something completely different. I want you to be part of David's official care team, not as a housekeeper, as his primary therapist and communication specialist. I'm prepared to offer you a salary that reflects that position, and I'm prepared to get you whatever credentials or certifications you need to do the job properly. Elena stared at him. She started to protest, to say that she wasn't qualified, that she was just a housekeeper. Marcus held up his hand. You're the only person who is qualified, he said quietly, because you're the only person who actually sees him, the only person who loves him. Elena's eyes filled with tears. She tried to speak but couldn't find the words. Marcus continued. I know you've lost a lot. I know you came here to escape your past. But I'm asking you to stay, not to escape anymore, to build something real, with David. With me, if you'll have it. Elena didn't answer immediately. She was terrified. She had learned long ago that loving something meant being vulnerable to losing it. But she also knew that some things were worth the risk. Some people were worth the risk. She looked at Marcus and said yes. Over the next 6 months, David's progress accelerated beyond anyone's expectations. With Elena as his primary therapist, working alongside the specialists Marcus had assembled, David began to unlock more and more of his locked-in mind. His vocabulary expanded. Within 3 months, he could speak in short sentences. Elena, get water. Daddy, play music. I want go outside. The words came slowly and required enormous effort. But they came. David was communicating. David was expressing his needs, his wants, his thoughts. David was alive. The medical community began taking notice. Dr. Santos published preliminary findings about David's case. Other specialists who had worked with him contributed to the research. Slowly, David's case became known in pediatric neurology circles as a remarkable example of how consciousness could exist beneath what appeared to be complete unresponsiveness. The breakthrough had major implications for how doctors diagnosed and treated similar cases. But for Marcus and Elena, the significance wasn't academic. It was personal. It was intimate. It was watching a child learn to be in the world again. One afternoon, while Elena was working with David on a communication exercise, David made a request that made everyone stop. "David want know about Elena, mommy," he said slowly, his words careful and deliberate. Elena froze. She looked at Marcus, who was observing the session. They had never discussed Elena's past with David. They had assumed he couldn't understand such complex information. But David had clearly been listening, observing, absorbing more than they realized. Elena sat beside David's bed. "David, what do you want to know?" David want to know why Elena's sad sometimes. Elena felt her throat tighten. She glanced at Marcus again. He gave her a slight nod. "You can tell him." So Elena did. She sat there in David's room, and for the first time in years, she told her story. She told him about a daughter she had loved, about mistakes she had made, about losing custody, about spending years believing she was broken beyond repair, about coming to this house and finding and caring for him a reason to believe in herself again. David listened with perfect stillness, his eyes focused on her face. When she finished, he made a sound, a word that took enormous effort, but that came out clear. "Elena, good mommy." Elena started to cry. She held David's small hand and let the tears fall. David had just given her something she thought she had lost forever. Permission to be a mother, permission to love, permission to hope. That evening, Marcus found Elena on the terrace overlooking the gardens. She was sitting alone, watching the sunset. He joined her without speaking. For a long time, they sat in silence. Then Elena spoke. "I need to contact my daughter. I need to try to rebuild that relationship. I can't undo the past, but I can't ignore it either." Marcus nodded. "I'll help you," he said. "Whatever you need." Elena turned to look at him. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Marcus considered the question. "Because you saved my son," he said finally. "But more than that, because you showed me what it means to believe in someone when there's no rational reason to. Because you taught me that love isn't something that requires the perfect circumstances. It requires courage. And you have more of that than anyone I've ever met." Elena reached over and took his hand. It was the first time they had deliberately made physical contact as something other than caretakers working together. It felt significant. It felt like a beginning. David's progress continued to accelerate. By month 9, he was speaking in full sentences, though each word still required significant effort. He was beginning to understand complex concepts. He was asking questions about the world. He was, for the first time in his life, actually participating in his own existence. The medical team updated their assessments constantly. David would likely never fully recover. The damage to his brain was too severe. But the degree to which his consciousness could be engaged, his ability to communicate, his capacity to learn and grow, all of it far exceeded initial predictions. David had become a living example of human resilience, of the power of the brain to adapt and compensate, of the importance of never giving up on someone, even when the evidence suggests you should. But beyond the medical achievements, something else was happening in the Wellington house. It was becoming a home in a way it had never been before. Marcus was present, Elena was present, and David was present in a way that mattered. The machines were still there, the equipment still necessary, but they hummed in the background now, rather than controlling everything. The house was filled with music, with laughter, with the kind of ordinary joy that comes from simply being together. 3 months into their partnership, Elena received a letter. It was from her ex-partner, the man who had custody of their daughter. He had read about her online, read about her work with David, and had been moved by her story. He wanted to know if Elena would like to see her daughter, that she had asked about her, that she wanted to know her mother. Elena read the letter 3 times before she could believe it was real. Marcus found her sitting with the letter in her hands, tears streaming down her face. She looked up at him. She wants to meet me. Our daughter. She wants to meet me. Marcus pulled her into his arms. Then let's make that happen, he said. The meeting took place on neutral ground, in a park near the city center. Elena was terrified. Her hands shook as she got ready. She had rehearsed what she would say 1,000 times, and each time the words fell apart in her mind. What if her daughter hated her? What if she had built up years of resentment? What if this was a mistake? Marcus drove her to the park and waited nearby, giving Elena space but staying close enough that she could see him if she needed grounding. Elena walked toward the playground where they had arranged to meet, and then she saw her. A girl with Elena's eyes and someone else's smile. 12 years old, years. Old enough to remember her mother was missing. Old enough to have questions about why. Elena stopped walking, afraid to startle the girl. She stood there, just watching, taking in every detail. The girl noticed her. Their eyes met, and without speaking, without any of the rehearsed words Elena had prepared, the girl walked toward her mother. Elena dropped to her knees and held her daughter as she cried. Years of separation, of pain, of regret, all of it poured out in that moment of reconnection. Her daughter, whose name was Amara, wrapped her arms around Elena and said, "Mommy, I missed you so much." That one sentence healed something in Elena that she thought had broken permanently. Over the following weeks, Elena began rebuilding her relationship with Amara. It started slowly. Brief visits, careful conversations, rebuilding trust. But Amara was open to it. She wanted her mother in her life. She had questions, legitimate ones about what had happened, about why Elena had been separated from her, about the custody case. Elena answered all of them with honest, age-appropriate truth. She didn't make excuses for her mistakes. She acknowledged that she had made poor decisions. But she also explained that she had been fighting to become a better person, that meeting David had given her purpose and hope again, and that now, with Amara willing to let her back in, she felt like she could actually move forward. One afternoon, Elena brought Amara to the Wellington house to meet David. Marcus had prepared the space carefully, making sure everything was comfortable and welcoming. David was sitting up in his specialized chair now, his posture stronger every week. When Amara walked in, David turned to look at her with curiosity. "Elena, who is?" David asked, the words still effortful but clear. "This is my daughter," Elena said. "Her name is Amara." David smiled. He was learning to smile now, and each smile was a small miracle. "Hello, Amara," David said carefully. "Welcome to my house." Amara looked at her mother. "Is David your baby?" "No," Elena said. "David is special to me. He's like my son." Amara nodded like she understood something profound. She walked over to David and sat beside him. "Can you tell me about yourself?" she asked politely. David began to tell her things. About his progress in speech therapy. About the music he liked. About the colors he could see from his window. About learning to communicate when for so long he couldn't. Amara listened carefully and asked good questions. Elena and Marcus watched from a distance, witnessing something neither of them had expected. A connection forming between the girl and the boy. Not because they were obligated to connect, but because they both understood, in their own ways, what it meant to be trapped and to find a way back to the world. That moment, watching them together, Elena felt something settle in her chest. Peace. Real peace. For the first time in so many years. 1 year after Elena first walked into the Wellington house as a housekeeper, Marcus threw a party. Not a grand gala, but a genuine celebration with the people who mattered. Dr. Santos and her team came, the physical therapist, the speech pathologist, the specialized educators, friends Marcus had reconnected with, and Elena's family, including Amara and Amara's father, who had become supportive and friendly as he saw what Elena was doing with her life. David sat in his chair in the center of the room, dressed in a small suit, looking dignified and happy. When people congratulated him on his progress, he responded with genuine words. "I work very hard," he would say. "Elena and Daddy helped me." And each time he said it, it was clear how much those words meant to him. Because they were his words, his achievement, his voice. Toward the end of the evening, Marcus pulled Elena aside. He held a small box in his hand. "Elena," he said, his voice serious in a way that made her heart jump. "I know this is fast. I know we've been focused on David and your recovery and rebuilding your family. But I need to ask you something." He opened the box to reveal a diamond ring. "I'm asking because I love you. I'm asking because you saved my son. I'm asking because you make me want to be a better man. And I'm asking because I can't imagine my life without you anymore. Will you marry me?" Elena stared at the ring and then at Marcus's face. Everything inside her wanted to say yes. But she was terrified. She was terrified of wanting something this badly. Terrified of the risk. Terrified of potentially losing it. But then she looked across the room at David, who was telling someone about his favorite book. She thought about her daughter, who had given her a second chance. She thought about how far she had come from the broken woman who had arrived at this house a year ago. Sometimes, she realized, the only way forward was to take the leap. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." The celebration that erupted in the room wasn't just for the engagement, it was for all of them. For David, who had come back from a place everyone thought was irreversible. For Elena, who had found redemption and purpose. For Marcus, who had learned that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or achieved through force of will alone. They had to be received. They had to be built on love and patience, and the willingness to believe in impossible things. 6 months later, on a perfect spring day, Elena and Marcus were married on the terrace of the Wellington estate. David was the ring bearer, carefully walking with his specialized walker, his face radiant with the importance of his role. Amara was Elena's maid of honor. The ceremony was small but perfect. "Doctor," Santos cried. The staff applauded. David managed to throw the ring pillow in the right direction, which everyone considered a triumph. And when Marcus and Elena kissed, it felt like every broken thing was finally finding its way back to wholeness. The reception was held on the grounds. Music played. People danced. David sat at a table with Amara, and they talked about books and music and all the things David was learning to love. Elena found herself surrounded by people who cared about her, who saw her not as the broken woman from her past, but as someone who had fought her way back to life. Her daughter was proud of her. Her husband loved her. David needed her. And for the first time, Elena let herself believe that maybe she deserved to be happy, that maybe second chances were real, that maybe broken things could be healed. The years following the wedding brought continued progress and unexpected joy. David continued to improve steadily. By age 8, he was communicating in full paragraphs, his speech still requiring effort, but increasingly clear and articulate. He attended a specialized school 3 days a week, where he was the only student with his particular condition, but also the most remarkable one in ways that inspired his teachers and classmates. He had favorite teachers. He had friends. He had a life. He still required physical assistance with many tasks. He would likely never walk completely independently. He would never be without some level of disability. But David was undeniably, unmistakably alive. He was a person with opinions and preferences and dreams. He participated in his own existence in meaningful ways. And watching him grow, Marcus and Elena never forgot that this remarkable boy almost didn't get a chance. Almost. because one woman had the courage to question the experts. Almost, because one woman had seen past the diagnosis to the person underneath. Almost, because one woman had loved him when it was easier not to. A year after David started school, Elena received a phone call that sent her into Marcus's arms with tears of joy and disbelief. It was a lawyer. The custody case from her past had been reopened. New evidence had emerged. The accusation that had destroyed her career and separated her from her daughter had been re-examined. It was found to be unsubstantiated. Not only that, but there was evidence that it had been deliberately falsified by someone with a grudge. Elena's name was being formally cleared. Her professional credentials could be restored if she wanted them. Her daughter was legally documented as living with her full-time. Everything that had been taken from her was being returned. Elena held Marcus as she wept, not from sadness anymore, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen as innocent, of being believed, of having the world acknowledge that she had not deserved what had happened to her. Marcus held her and whispered that he had always believed her, that he had known the moment he met her that she was good, that she had a good heart. And now the world was finally catching up to what he had already known. The Wellington estate, once cold and quiet and full of machines measuring a life that wasn't supposed to happen, had become something entirely different. It had become a home, filled with laughter and music and the sounds of a family. Elena had revived her nursing credentials and now worked part-time as David's personal health coordinator, while also doing volunteer work with children with severe neurological conditions. She was helping other families navigate the complexities that she and Marcus had navigated. She was helping other parents believe in impossible things. Marcus had stepped back from daily operations of his company, bringing in trusted leadership to run it while he focused on what mattered. He started a foundation in David's name, focused on research into consciousness and locked-in conditions, on supporting families with severely disabled children, on funding specialized schools like the one David attended. The Wellington Foundation became known for its innovative approach and its insistence that every life had value, that every person deserved to be seen and believed in. Amara grew into a beautiful, compassionate young woman who wanted to be a pediatric neurologist, inspired by watching David's journey and by seeing how medical expertise combined with love could change everything. She spent time working with her mother and David, learning the complexities of his condition, dreaming of one day helping other children like him. The house filled with more family, extended relatives, friends who became like family. The quiet corridors that had once echoed with only the sound of machines now echoed with laughter. Children played in the gardens. Birthday parties were celebrated. Holidays were observed with the kind of joy that comes from knowing exactly how precious each moment is. And at the center of it all was David, a boy who was never supposed to communicate, never supposed to develop, never supposed to be anything more than a body kept alive by machines. David, who beat every odd by being exactly who Elena had believed he could be, who spoke his truth, who participated in his own life, who became not just a symbol of human resilience, but a real person with real relationships and real impact on the people who loved him. Years later, when David was 16, he was asked to speak at a medical conference about his experiences. He had never been shy about sharing his story, and his speech was remarkably articulate despite the effort it still required. He talked about being trapped, about hearing voices but not being able to respond, about not knowing if anyone believed he was in there. He talked about the moment a woman started humming a lullaby and how that sound had been like a lifeline thrown to him in the darkness. He talked about his father finally starting to believe. He talked about love being the greatest therapy of all. In the audience, Elena cried openly. She had never expected him to come this far. None of them had. And yet here he was. This beautiful boy who had been written off as a tragedy, standing on a stage, speaking his truth, changing minds, inspiring a generation of medical professionals to look deeper, to believe harder, to never give up on someone simply because the experts said it was impossible. When David finished his speech, the standing ovation lasted for 5 minutes. Doctors who had dismissed locked-in conditions as hopeless felt something shift in their understanding. Parents of severely disabled children found new hope. The world began to understand that consciousness was more mysterious and resilient than conventional wisdom suggested. But for Marcus and Elena, the most important thing wasn't the applause or the recognition. It was the look on David's face when he stepped off the stage and came to them. It was the way he hugged them both and said, "I did it. I did what I set out to do. I told my story." The journey from David's initial diagnosis to this moment had not been easy. There had been moments of doubt, of despair, of wondering if they were fooling themselves into believing in something that couldn't happen. There had been setbacks and plateaus and days when progress seemed to stop. There had been the ongoing reality that David would never be fully typical, that he would always require assistance, that his disability was permanent. But what had changed was the understanding of what disability meant. It didn't mean the end of life. It didn't mean the absence of consciousness or feeling or desire or worth. It meant different. It meant challenging. It meant requiring support and adaptations and patience. But it didn't mean impossible. It didn't mean that love couldn't reach through the barriers. It didn't mean that one person believing in you couldn't change everything. Elena had come to that house broken, running from her past, convinced that she was beyond redemption. She had left it whole. She had left it as a wife, a mother, a healer, a woman who had found her purpose in one of the most unexpected places. Marcus had come to that house isolated, hiding from grief, convinced that his son was gone. He had left it transformed. He had learned that money couldn't fix everything, that presence mattered more than position, that the most important things couldn't be accomplished alone. And David had come to that house locked in a world of silence. And he had emerged as a voice for so many people who couldn't speak. Not because the medical professionals were wrong, but because they hadn't been willing to look deep enough, to believe hard enough, to love enough. One evening, years into their marriage, Marcus and Elena sat on the terrace overlooking the gardens. David was inside doing homework with Amara. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and orange. Marcus reached over and took Elena's hand. He still did this often. He still seemed amazed that she was there, that she had chosen him, that she had chosen them. "Do you ever think about the day you walked into this house?" he asked. "Every day," Elena said. "I knew something was different about David from the moment I saw him. I knew the diagnosis was wrong. I knew there was someone in there. I just didn't know how to prove it." Marcus squeezed her hand. "You didn't have to prove it. You just had to believe it. And you did." Elena leaned her head against his shoulder. "We were lucky," she said. "Lucky that I was here. Lucky that you were willing to listen. Lucky that David was strong enough to keep fighting." Marcus kissed the top of her head. "The luckiest," he agreed. And from inside the house, they could hear David's voice as he explained something to Amara. David's voice. His words. His thoughts. His life. Speaking and being heard and mattering in ways that everyone had once said were impossible. The machines were still there in David's room. They were still necessary. But they no longer defined him. They were simply part of the infrastructure of his life, like the adapted silverware and the specialized furniture and all the other tools that allowed him to live as fully as he could. But what defined David now was his presence, his personality, his fierce determination to be part of the world that had tried to leave him behind. And the people who loved him, the woman who had believed in him when no one else would, the man who had learned to slow down and actually see his son, the sister who had become his best friend, the mother who had recovered her daughter, the family that had been broken and battered and scarred, but that had also been healed, that had been transformed. That had become a testament to what love could accomplish when combined with courage and belief, and the simple refusal to accept that some things are impossible. This is where their story ends. Not where everything is perfect, because life never is, but where everything that matters has been found, where the broken have been made whole again, where the lost have been found, where a simple act of belief changed everything, where one woman's courage showed a father and a child that they were worth fighting for, where love conquered what seemed unconquerable. And it all started with a hum, a simple lullaby, a woman who cared enough to try when trying didn't seem to matter. Marcus Wellington, the billionaire who thought he had lost his son, discovered that sometimes the most valuable things in life can't be bought. They can only be received. Elena Davis, the broken woman running from her past, discovered that redemption isn't something you find. It's something you build, one small act of courage at a time. And David Wellington, the boy who wasn't supposed to exist as a conscious being, discovered that the only diagnosis that mattered was the one he wrote for himself. A life. A real life. A life worth living. A life that spoke volumes about the power of belief, the strength of love, and the impossible beauty of second chances. In the years that followed, David's case would become something of a legend in the medical community. Dr. Santos would publish comprehensive research documenting David's progress, his improvements, his remarkable journey from what everyone thought was permanent unconsciousness to a fully engaged, communicative young man. The research would spawn new protocols, new ways of assessing consciousness in seemingly unresponsive patients, new methods of communication that would help countless other children trapped in similar situations. Universities would invite David to speak to neurology students. Hospitals would adopt his case as a teaching example. Medical conferences would feature panels discussing how consciousness could persist in ways that traditional neurological testing failed to detect. And through it all, David remained humble. He was aware of how unlikely his story was. He knew that not every child in his situation would have an Elena. Not every family would have the resources to pursue alternatives when traditional medicine said there was no hope. He became an advocate not just for children like him, but for the parents and caregivers who fought to believe in them. He spoke about the importance of funding research, of training specialists in locked-in conditions, of never accepting a diagnosis as final when a person's consciousness hadn't been fully established. He talked about Elena without hesitation. He was not shy about crediting her with literally saving his life. In interviews, he would often say, "Elena saw me when everyone else saw a diagnosis. She saw a person when the doctor saw a tragedy. She heard me when I couldn't speak. And because she believed I was in there, she gave me the tools to prove it." Elena would always try to deflect credit in these moments. She would say that she had simply done what needed to be done, that anyone would have done it. But David and Marcus both knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have risked their job to advocate for a child they were supposed to be ignoring. Not everyone would have trusted their instinct over the verdict of the world's top specialists. Not everyone would have had the courage to be wrong publicly if they had been mistaken. But Elena had. And that courage had changed everything. The Wellington Foundation grew into something extraordinary. It funded research facilities. It trained specialists. It provided grants to families who couldn't afford the therapies their disabled children needed. It established support groups for parents dealing with diagnoses that seemed hopeless. Elena worked with the foundation in an advisory capacity, bringing her lived experience to decisions about how money should be allocated and what the real needs of families were. Marcus ran it with the same intensity he had once applied to his pharmaceutical company, but with a focus on helping people rather than accumulating wealth. Together, they built something that mattered, something that rippled out into the world and changed countless lives. But their greatest achievement wasn't measurable in grants distributed or research funded. It was David himself. The boy who beat the odds. The young man who spoke when he wasn't supposed to be able to. The human being who proved that consciousness could survive what everyone thought would destroy it. Years after that first day when Elena had hummed the lullaby and David had turned toward the sound, they would sometimes return to that moment in conversation. Elena would ask David if he remembered. David would smile and say he didn't remember the sound itself, but he remembered the feeling. The feeling that someone cared, that someone believed, that someone wouldn't give up. "It's funny," David would say. "I thought I was completely locked in. I thought I was never going to be able to tell anyone anything. But somehow, her voice got through. Her belief got through. And that changed everything." Marcus would listen to these conversations and feel grateful in a way that transcended normal gratitude. He was grateful for his son's life. He was grateful for Elena's courage. He was grateful for the second chances that life sometimes offered if you were brave enough to reach for them. He was grateful that they had found each other in the chaos and built something real, something lasting, something that mattered. On David's 18th birthday, the family threw a party that overflowed the Wellington estate. Friends and family came from all over the world, medical professionals who had been part of David's journey. researchers who had studied his case, teachers who had worked with him in school, and people who had never met David, but who had been inspired by his story. David gave a speech that night. He talked about his birthday as a milestone, but not in the usual sense. Most 18-year-olds celebrated becoming legal adults. David celebrated becoming a living testimony to what he had always known: that he mattered, that his life had value, that consciousness wasn't something that could be measured on a simple scale of yes or no. It was something complex and mysterious and resilient. He talked about the people who had believed in him: his father, who had learned to listen; his mother, Elena, who had seen him when no one else would; his sister, Amara, who had fought to understand him. He talked about the doctors and therapists who had worked with him. But most of all, he talked about the importance of never giving up on someone simply because they seem unreachable. He talked about the darkness of that locked-in place, and how a voice, a belief, a refusal to accept defeat could reach even through that darkness. He talked about hope, about the importance of it, about how it had sustained him even when he couldn't communicate that he was hoping, and he talked about love. He said that love was the most powerful therapy, that love was what had brought him back from a place he wasn't even supposed to exist in, that love was what continued to push him forward every single day. In the audience, Elena cried openly. Marcus held her hand. Amara stood and applauded along with the entire room when David finished. It was a moment of perfect clarity. This was what they had built. Not just a family, but a testament to what could happen when people refused to accept that some things were impossible. Years later, when asked how she had known to trust her instinct about David, Elena would always give the same answer. She would say that she had learned something from her own broken experiences. She had learned that people weren't always what they seemed. She had learned that diagnosis didn't define capacity. She had learned that sometimes the things that break us are the same things that teach us to see more clearly. She had lost custody of her daughter. That loss had broken her, but it had also taught her to notice the invisible, to see past the surface, to believe in possibilities that others couldn't see. When she saw David, broken and trapped and written off, she recognized something of herself in him. A person trapped inside circumstances beyond their control. A person who just needed someone to believe they were still in there. And so she had believed. She had believed hard and loud and courageously. And that belief had changed everything. The story of David Wellington, the boy who wasn't supposed to exist as a conscious being, became the story of how the impossible became possible. It became the story of a billionaire who learned that his greatest treasure wasn't his money, or his business, or his power. It was his son. It was his family. It was the love he had learned to give and receive. It became the story of a woman who found redemption not in running away from her past, but in helping someone else recover from theirs. It became the story of a boy who proved that the human spirit was capable of things that defied logic, that defied probability, that defied every expectation. And it became the story of a simple lullaby that saved a life. A melody that crossed the barrier between consciousness and unconsciousness. A sound that said, "You matter. I see you. I believe in you. And I will not stop fighting for you." That is the power of one person believing in another. That is the power of refusing to accept that some things are impossible. That is the power of love. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought, and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.